Hi, my name is Stephanie Lamb, and I'm the research coordinator for the Gynecologic Cancer Initiative. Today, I'll be presenting with one of my colleagues, Nicole Kay, who is an experienced communications professional, but also a cervical cancer survivor and patient partner for the Gynecologic Cancer Initiative. Thank you to the conference organizers for giving us an opportunity to present today on the GOSH podcast, Reflections on Storytelling and Knowledge Translation. Before we get started, we'd like to take some time to acknowledge that both Nicole and I are joining today from the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Stolo, Kakite, Coquitlam First Nations. As we present our work today, we talk a lot about the importance of storytelling in the context of knowledge translation, and we're reminded that Indigenous people have always been the storytellers and to have used storytelling to instill knowledge, history, as well as connections. And we are both forever grateful to have the privilege to be living and doing this work on these territories. So this is a quick agenda for today. We'll touch briefly on gynae cancer research and knowledge translation, then share more about the GOSH podcast, our process, and some of our key learning lessons. So British Columbia has been a longstanding global leader in advancing gynecologic cancer research. Research in BC has led to guideline and policy changes around the world in several different domains. It includes work led by RISI researchers in opportunistic self-injectomy for ovarian cancer prevention, HPV screening and vaccines for cervical cancer prevention, reflex BRCA1 and 2 testing for ovarian cancer, as well as molecular classification for endometrial, ovarian, and vulvar cancer. In 2019, some of the key leaders in this space came together to form the Gynecologic Cancer Initiative. The GCI is a provincial initiative dedicated to accelerating transformative research on prevention, detection, treatment, and survivorship of gynecologic cancers to reduce the incidence, death, and suffering of these cancers by 50% by 2034. And we do this by working across institutions, across cancer types, across the spectrum of health research, and across stakeholder groups, including researchers, clinicians, trainees, and patients. An important priority for us is to develop more effective knowledge translation strategies to ensure patients have access to the latest evidence in cancer research. We have been collaborating with patients to develop a suite of different strategies using newsletters, media articles, social media platforms, videos, as well as blog articles. One of our strategies, the GOSH podcast, is a project that is patient-inspired and patient-led. We believe that there's a lot of value in enabling and supporting these sorts of projects. Not only does it empower the patient partners who are involved in these initiatives, it also helps develop platforms that are truly patient-centered.
So what is the GOSH podcast? The GOSH podcast stands for the Gynecologic Oncology Sharing Hub, and it's a platform that was developed through the Gynecologic Cancer Initiative. It is a tool we created to connect gynecologic cancer patients, researchers, and clinicians who have a common goal of education and empowering one another. On the podcast, we share patient voices and stories, emerging research, and the latest information about gynecologic cancers and patient resources our listeners can tap into. It has turned into a really effective strategy for storytelling and knowledge dissemination. It has also allowed us to share stories in different languages and improve accessibility of patient stories for diverse populations. The vision for the podcast came while I was going through my own treatment for cervical cancer. I was searching for ways to connect with others who were or had been on similar journeys as myself. I found that I was, sometimes spending too much time searching Google for blogs or different tools to connect with other patients. And some of the supports that I did find just didn't speak to what I was looking for in terms of providing meaningful connection and informed resources. I also found myself looking for ways that I could support or give back to the cancer community. At this time, I also started listening to a lot of podcasts. Podcasts were a really easy way to pass the time while I was in the waiting room, waiting for treatment to begin, or just throughout the day. At that point, the idea was born: if I could create a space that highlighted patient stories to help build that community and connection I was searching for, and in addition, share research to help educate patients, I could really give back. I presented the idea at the GCI and Women's Health Research Cluster Survivorship Summit in 2019. This is actually one of the original slides that I shared with that room of researchers and clinicians. I thought myself and other patients would have really benefited from some of these recommendations. In particular, I wanted to build an online community that shares patient, caregiver, and medical stories, perspectives, and support. The podcast was an idea that I included, and this is when the GCI approached me to begin planning and building this platform.
So we'll now talk a little bit about our process in developing this podcast. First, it was really important for us to find inspiration. We spent a lot of time researching and found podcasts that were similar to what we were hoping to produce to help us define our scope and to figure out how it all works. There were actually a lot of podcasts out there sharing patient stories, such as You, Me, and the Big C, and others that were solely focused on sharing research, such as the WHRI's At Women's Research. From that research, we were then able to start asking ourselves the questions. It was important for us to answer these bigger questions about what we wanted our resource to look like. Who is our audience? What style do we want for our podcast? What type of questions were we hoping to cover? And what are our overall goals and objectives?
At the same time, we were also trying to figure out our logistics. There are a lot of considerations to start a podcast, including, where would we host our podcast, to what kind of equipment was needed, to how would we edit the episodes, to where would we get music for our episodes, to how would we share it with the world. We did a lot of research to find out what the best strategies were for our platform. The next step was outreach and ideation. It's actually a really important part of our process that we do for every episode we record. This includes reaching out to potential guests and ideating the episode with them. No matter what episode we record, we always brainstorm and send the interview questions that we plan on asking our guests ahead of time. From there, the guests can let us know if they feel comfortable answering certain questions or if they want to include more information. For certain people, we also meet with them before the recording to develop a bit of a relationship and help us understand their story a little more. The next part of our process was the most important and probably the most difficult step of all. Just hitting record. Even though we did so much planning, it took a lot to get past the hurdle of just hitting the record button. We both had to mentally adjust our mindset to know that there was no such thing as a perfect recording, but that we can still create a space that is comfortable enough for us to bring these stories and this work to life.
So after recording, we always have an iterative post-production phase. We edit our episodes using a free program, and usually there are a few sets of ears that listen to the episode before it gets released. Our GCI communications team will do a first pass on the episode to weave the stories together and to add or take out any necessary content. Nicole and I will then do a second listen on the episode before the episode is sent back to our guests for their review. We always make it very clear that these episodes and stories belong to our guest. If they aren't comfortable sharing something, if they want to add something, or if they just don't like how they sound, we will always take the episode back to the drawing board. The next two steps work hand in hand. We do a significant amount of work to share our podcast episodes on social media, leveraging all of our platforms, including Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. This is a great way for us to get our message out to our community and to share the podcast more widely with the general public. As part of this work, we also do a lot to maintain accessibility of our podcast. So each of our episodes come with a text transcript and detailed show notes that are available on our website. This is a really important part to make sure our podcast can reach all members of the community. So the Gosh podcast has officially produced 2 seasons where we interviewed 18 guests, created 27 episodes, and over 800 minutes of podcast content, sharing gynae cancer patient stories and research. Our analytics have also told us that these episodes are reaching people around the world, including countries in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia.
We'll now touch briefly on some of our main lessons learned. The very first lesson that we have is to just press record. As I mentioned earlier, this is something we both really struggled with. Even though we did a lot of planning, there was still a mental block for actually sitting down and recording an episode. We learned that by just taking the leap and pressing the record button, we were able to practice the skills it took to create a space for storytelling and knowledge translation. It was definitely daunting at first, but by pressing the record button, we were creating more opportunities for us to practice the skills. This has really become an really important part in building this platform and creating a safe space for other patients and for our guests. Another really important lesson learned is to listen to our listeners. It can be really challenging to listen to our listeners because as podcast co-hosts, we don't necessarily have the opportunity to connect and ask our listeners questions. However, we have learned a lot by taking a meaningful look at our podcast analytics. The process allowed us to understand things like demographics of our audience, where our audience is listening from, how long they listen to episodes, and which episodes were most popular. Understanding these things have helped us tailor future episodes to make them more appealing to our listeners.
So our third lesson learned is making space and holding space. So this has been really important for our podcast guests, especially when chatting with patients about their cancer journey. These can be very vulnerable conversations. So as podcast hosts, it is our job to make sure our guests are as comfortable as possible. So this can look like a bunch of different things for different people. It can mean doing a short icebreaker before hitting the record button, doing a pre-meeting to learn more about their story and to develop a relationship, or just providing reassurance about our post-production process. But most importantly, above it all, it is about interviewing our guests in a way that prioritizes their comfort as well as their safety.
And the last learning lesson we have is something that has set the foundation of our entire platform, and that is to center the patient experience. From the start, this podcast has been built with the patient voice as an important part of the platform. As a patient partner, being able to influence and shape this platform has helped to ensure that the podcast will continue to center the patient experience through storytelling and knowledge dissemination. This is also an important part of our conversation with researchers and clinicians, where we continue to ask questions about what the research means for patients and for survivors.
So as we move forward in this work, we are working towards a few different next steps. First is to expand our outreach strategies. We are doing this by reaching out to other podcasting platforms who already have an established audience and collaborating with them on joint episodes. We are also finding more opportunities to invite guests from other countries who are working in this space. We actually just recorded a really interesting 3-part series with a researcher, filmmaker, and patient from Australia who's working on a really interesting documentary called Conquering Cancer. We are also looking at ways to build more opportunities for connection. So when we launched our second season, we actually hosted a launch event where we invited Nicole and a few other patient partners and podcast guests to share their insights at a virtual event. It was actually a really popular event, and many researchers and clinicians enjoyed chatting and connecting directly with patient partners. And lastly, we want to focus on diversifying our patient stories. One of our recent episodes was recorded entirely in Cantonese, and we found that it was actually a really meaningful way to connect and share these sorts of stories with the Chinese community. As we continue building the platform, we are really focusing on prioritizing these next steps.
Overall, we have found that there is a lot of value in empowering and supporting patient-led and patient-inspired projects such as the GOSH podcast. We believe that podcasting can be a really effective strategy for community building and knowledge translation when it's designed with the right people in mind. The process in developing this knowledge translation tool has led us to really lean into some important lessons that can be used in developing other patient-inspired and patient-led knowledge translation projects. We want to take some time to thank the Gynecologic Cancer Initiative for supporting this project, and most importantly, to the patients and survivors who have graciously shared their stories with us. We're happy to take any questions. Thank you.